That worked. Man at the back just pushed a child into a door. Right, we're now standing in the outer ward of the Tower of London, that's to say between the inner and outer Bailing or defensive wall. The inner wall behind me is 50 feet high, the one behind you is 28 feet thick. To your left is Mint Street, so called because that was where all those coins of the British Empire were designed and produced up until 1810. Now the buildings that house that factory are known as the casemates, and they now serve as accommodation for some of my Yeoman Warder colleagues and their families. Hands up those of you who knew that beefeaters like me actually lived inside the Tower of London. How many of you didn't know that? How many of you couldn't care less where we lived? You can see a second floor of windows there. Behind those windows was the study to Sir Isaac Newton. He was the master of the mint here in the 17th century. He was a very clever man. He came up with the idea of milling the outside of coins to stop people clipping bits off them and making their own. That's very clever, isn't it? He also invented gravity children, a very fine British invention, invented right here in the Tower of London, just after he invented Apple. Now behind you is a tall, narrower archway than the one through which we passed. It's called the Sally Port or Royal Entrance, beyond which is a small drawbridge leading to the Queen's Stairs and directly accessing the River Thames. Rather than negotiate the dark, dirty and dangerous streets of London, royalty and nobility would travel along down the River Thames on their impressive barges. They tie up alongside those stairs and they gain entry through those gates which are original and date back more than 700 years. It was at those very gates that King Henry VIII so lovingly greeted his second wife, Queen Anne Boleyn, on the eve of their wedding. And we're going to reenact that scene right now. Just for clarity, I'll be the king. She was over an hour late. It does not pay to keep the king waiting. However, on looking upon her beautiful blue bowling eyes, his heart melted and he went down on one. He got down on his... He stood up. He took her hand, her massive hand in his, with a nightclub stamp still on it. Looked into... Tiger, I say. Looked into those eyes and he said, I promise to love you for the rest of your life. Poor Anne was fated to return to the Tower 3 years later, but for a very different reason, through a very different gate. Little round of applause for the beautiful Queen. Oh, I did all the work. This is the Bell Tower, and it's within this tower that Sir Thomas More was held for refusing to accept King Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church in England. At the same time, and for the very same reason, his good friend John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, was held in the upper chamber. Now, both men were to suffer terribly for about 15 months, but could not be persuaded to abandon their beliefs, and were finally led out of these buildings, through those gates and up the hill, to be publicly beheaded as traitors in 1535. Exactly 400 years later, both men were canonised as saints in the Roman Catholic faith. Another man to spend a bit of time here is a man called James Scott. He was the Duke of Monmouth, and he was the eldest of 13 illegitimate children of King Charles II. Now, after the death of his father, King Charles, this young man, James Scott, was persuaded to stake his claim to the throne because his uncle, King James II, was a practicing Roman Catholic. To press home his claim, he landed in the west country of England, and he marched inland, gathering popular Protestant support in what is known as the Monmouth or Pitchfork Rebellion. That rebellion was crushed at the Battle of Sedgemoor on the 6th of July 1685, but James Scott evaded capture by fleeing the battlefield. He hid in towns and villages for a few days, but he was quickly found and brought here to the Tower. There was no need for a trial, as he'd been condemned to death in his absence, and 3 days later he was led out of these buildings, through those gates and up the hill. But this time, instead of being pelted with fruit and vegetables like everybody else, all the ladies came and they threw flowers in his path as he walked up in silence. That's how incredibly handsome and popular he was. He looked a bit like me. An inflatable version of William Shatner. When he got to the top of the hill, he was met by the executioner, a man called Jack Ketch. I call him an executioner. He was actually a part-time executioner. He was a part-time butcher, and he was a full-time drinker. This was to be the most botched, bloody and brutal execution in English history. For Jack Ketch was not only drunk this day, he even managed to bring the wrong type of axe to the execution. It wasn't balanced, so he couldn't be very accurate, and it certainly wasn't very sharp. He famously took 5 strokes with the axe. Now, the first one landed squarely in James Scott's left shoulder blade. The second took the very top of his head off. Scott managed to get to his feet and said, "For God's sake, man, finish the job." When he went back down again, the next one hit him in the right shoulder blade. The fourth in the lower lumbar, the fifth skewed in Ketch's hand and slapped James Scott squarely across the back of the head, thankfully knocking him out. It was a further 3 strokes of the axe before it was obvious that Scott was dead. And even then, the head remained stubbornly attached to the body. And so Ketch improvised. He went down on his knees, pulled out his butcher's knife, and to the stunned silence of those looking on, proceeded to saw through the remaining stubborn sinews, tendons, gristle, veins, arteries, muscles, gore, and bone. Sweet dreams, kids. Now, strangely, the head and the body were returned to the tower and sewn back together, and we have no idea why. So that's a pretty nasty, gory story. And now it's time to be heading to Traitor's Gate.